All right, let's get into audience questions for the week. The first one is related to the Cuban protests and a situation that we've been talking about there for about 10 days now. David, why do some protests get so much more media attention than others? For example, there are currently protests happening in Guatemala and South Africa, and yet we hear nothing about them in American media, but we hear a lot about Cuba. Why is this? So the answer, there's two different answers. First, there's a sort of a commercialization of media answer. And then there's a political answer. And in the case of Cuba, it's actually a little bit of both. But it's absolutely true in the sense that first, let's figure out if the situations are different in terms of their level of notoriety. In Cuba, we've seen significant protests as well as serious crackdowns, many videos getting out of Cuban police, federal, local police, variety of different levels of law enforcement in Cuba, just grabbing people holding signs off the street, and a significant and serious crackdown. The protests have been related to mishandling of COVID, out of control inflation, a collapsing economy, lack of resources, lack of food, all sorts of different things. Similarly, in South Africa, there have been at least 32 people killed in clashes between police and protesters. The president of South Africa ordered soldiers to the country's two most densely populated provinces because crowds were ransacking retail stores, and the protests were in response to the jailing of the former president, Jacob Zuma. And it's been significantly chaotic in South Africa. Similarly, in Guatemala, there have been demands for the resignation of the president over his mishandling of the COVID pandemic, a shortage of vaccines, etc. There were protests there in Guatemala City as well as in other regions denouncing the president's handling of the situation, demands for the president, Giammattei, to step down, and cases are skyrocketing. Hospitals are about to collapse, very low vaccination rate, significant chaos in Guatemala. But yet we barely hear about those in American media, but we hear about Cuba. So what is the explanation? There's really two. One, the history of U.S.-Cuban relations is a big part of it. Cuban circumstances in Cuba relate to so many American political stories, including this battle over socialism and communism that the right has been fighting against communists like Joe Biden. I mean, it's ridiculous, right? But it's very useful for the right to talk about Cuba and anything bad that happens in Cuba. There's also a much more important, from a political standpoint, Cuban American population in terms of its impact on the results in Florida. And so politically, it's a much more useful population. Most non-Guatemalans aren't super concerned about the Guatemalan American vote as a voting bloc in the United States. For the and this applies to Argentinian Americans like me, and right, I mean, there's just less political utility. Mexico is certainly an interesting one because of political reasons, and Cuba is as well. Similarly, South African Americans, not like Cuban Americans in terms of a group that a state can hinge on. So in particular, in that context, it's logical that we're hearing more about Cuba than we are about Guatemala and South Africa. And then there's just like the straight up commercial narrative story. Which narrative is going to make news viewers tune in the longest and either happy or angry at someone so that they continue to share articles and sort of engage, because that drives ratings and ad revenue. Because of the first piece that I mentioned, there's not as much need or interest in appealing to Guatemalan Americans or South African Americans. It's not going to drive ratings. It's not going to drive news revenue. Talking about Cuba very, very much does. And it's a similar question, actually, to why do some shootings get more attention than others? The right loves to say only shootings of minorities by white people get attention because that serves the left. The left often points out that the right in general doesn't want to talk about shootings unless the perpetrator is non-white. And it's like very, very clean along racial lines. Both stories are. The reality is there's much more to it. There's power dynamics. There's was it an officer involved shooting, or was this, quote, civilians? But there's also, I mean, when you look at how many mass shootings take place every day, there's clearly a selection bias that's taking place. And it's much similarly oriented along the same lines. Two things. One, what will generate interest from the standpoint of being a news story? And number two, which shootings are of political relevance to either or both sides. And it's a very similar thing with the story of which protests get attention. There's something I'm missing in this analysis. There's more to it. Guatemala, South Africa, Cuba. Certainly let me know. I would love to hear it. One of our sponsors is SteadyMD Primary Care, the easier and more affordable way to do primary care. And they're giving you 50% off because you are in my audience. You just answer a few questions. SteadyMD will match you with a licensed primary care physician that's tailored to your needs. You'll have a 1-hour virtual appointment and start a meaningful relationship with your new doctor. And from then on, your doctor will be available to you by text, phone, and video chat. It's not some random doctor on call. Your SteadyMD doctor has a limited number of patients. You get the attention you deserve, and they can help you with anything your primary care doc normally would. It's very cool how it works. You don't need insurance. It's just $99 a month, no other fees or copays for visits. Take the free quiz and see which doctor is a perfect fit for you. You'll get 50% off your first month when you go to steadymd.com/Pacman. No risk, no long-term commitment. The link is right underneath the video.